So in this segment, we're going to be discussing a piece in The Observer, which is the Observer's view on Brexit and how the Tories are paying the price for their dishonesty. So 7 years after the referendum, the evidence of its tragic consequences for the country are mounting. We keep seeing the consequences of Brexit, but the electorate, or parts of them, seem blind to it. And the two major parties, Labour and the Tories, one is inflicted the damage, the Brexit damage, and the other is so desperate not to offend certain voters, it won't talk about it, at least in my opinion. Brexit was sold to voters 7 years ago on the basis it would be the answer to a myriad of problems. It would address Britain's laggardly growth by putting rocket boosters under the economy. It would free up money to spend on the underfunded NHS. It would boost wages in lower paid jobs by reducing immigration levels. Of course, it would also, quote, take back control of our borders, so all of that kind of nonsense as well. And it would reinvigorate our parliamentary democracy by returning sovereignty to Westminster, which we obviously know it was a myth, the idea that Parliament wasn't sovereign. And it's actually crazy, the amount of lies the Brexiteers got away with, and the media just sat there and watched. They let this stuff slide. Brexit boosting growth was a non-starter. Putting up trade barriers with your nearest trading partner in the EU was never going to work. Freeing up money for the NHS, again, madness. Even the amount we paid into the budget, all that's been taken away by our commitments to the EU's budget and the liabilities we owe. Those were based on the commitments that we had to the EU and still have. Even the 358 million on a bus was a complete lie. There was never going to be anything for the NHS anyways. Why would the Tories, who have significantly underfunded the NHS year on year, suddenly put all of this money into the NHS? It's just nonsense. Wages is the only thing you can try and argue. And wages have gone up a bit due to labour shortages being the main driving force, especially in certain industries and in the private sector. But given that our inflation's been so high, and Brexit's cost us so many billions, to the average consumer as well directly, and will remain higher than the Eurozone. Those wages have been chewed up. Those wage increases are gone, and will continue to do so. Honestly, there needs to be an autopsy, because this is one of the greatest cons ever pulled on the public. Even I would argue Trump's victory in 2016 wasn't as bad as this. Honestly. None of this was ever going to, materialise, and recent years have only served to underline just how false these promises were. Last week, the government finally put to bed the idea it was feasible to scrap thousands of retained EU regulations in one swoop. Kemi Badenoch junked the profoundly undemocratic sunset clauses in the retained EU law bill, and she was maligned by it, by the ERG. Honestly, I've never seen someone get mocked so ruthlessly by their own team. The legislation was totally unworkable. The government has not even been able to produce a comprehensive list of regulations that it covers. Even the total number of 4,000 it is assumed it would apply to at the time was just an estimate. They had no idea how many laws they were going to act. This time allowed by the government just a few months to review it, recodify huge swathes of domestic legislation, covering areas as diverse as employment rights, consumer protections, and the environment was completely unrealistic. The bill also gives huge discretionary powers to ministers to make changes to the law without any parliamentary oversight or consultation with businesses, organisations, and people whose lives could be deeply affected by them. They have narrowed down, this legislation to about 600 laws they want to get rid of. Still massively problematic. They have no mandate to do this, yet here they are doing it anyways. This is one thing you can call an elected dictatorship, giving one party so many MPs that they can act with impunity, almost because they can afford to lose MPs into double digits but still have the numbers to pass legislation. When it comes to legislation like this, all Parliament can do is slow it down, and I hope it does. I hope it doesn't pass. I really do. But there's only one thing we can do, really.
Start praying, boy.
Put simply, it would enable ministers to make sweeping changes to the laws that affect people's everyday lives, like how much people are paid for holidays, and the amount of vacation time they're allowed, the minimum air quality standards with absolutely no democratic scrutiny at all. It certainly does not increase parliamentary sovereignty, as the government has claimed, and as Brexit was meant to do. Rather, it represents a massive power grab by ministers. It has also created huge legislative uncertainty for businesses who could not know what regulations would apply in a few months' time. And It's a nightmare for most businesses. It means the EU will increase the amount of checks to make sure goods coming into the EU are EU compliant. It could also lead to tariffs or the end of the TCA, because that level of playing field will be gone, and we can say goodbye to that deal and potentially many others, because a lot of the rollover deals were based on EU standards. It could lead to increased problems with exports to Northern Ireland as well. I read there will be no checks on goods coming out of the UK-based free ports, which is also problematic because trade deals do not include free ports. Free ports, they don't use the national standards within the country they're based in. They set the rules for themselves. And if those goods are flowing into Great Britain from these free ports, they can then be sold on to other countries. Free ports are often excluded from trade deals for reasons like this, because they're made by lower standards, lower wage workers effectively. So what you can do is you can export goods to a country more cheaply via these free ports. And that's the reason why, countries are very wary of them. So it's just what the government are doing here is absolute stupidity personified. The false claim that the government is restoring parliamentary sovereignty while it's actually driving this key constitutional principle into the ground is just the latest in a long line of lies Conservative politicians have fed voters about Brexit. It started with the Vote Leave campaign, the claim that leaving the EU would free up £350 million a week for the NHS, and that has been ruled a, quote, clear misuse of official statistics, end quote, by the UK Statistics Authority, and the suggestion that staying in the EU would mean Britain would be set to share a border with Syria and Iraq. This would be about if Turkey joined the EU, which was not going to happen for a lot of reasons, and this was a thing Brexiteers pushed regardless of that, and they tried to make all sorts of nonsense arguments. Penny Mordaunt got pulled up on that a while ago. In fact, if the UK wanted to, we could have vetoed Turkey's ascension into the EU. So all we have done now is made it more likely that Turkey will be an EU member state, because we could have been one of the countries that vetoed it, their ascension. The lies continued under Boris Johnson's premiership with his false statement that the Northern Ireland Protocol he had negotiated would involve no customs checks on goods going between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. In fairness, he's not wrong about goods going from Northern Ireland to GB. He's wrong about goods going from GB to Northern Ireland. That's where the problems are. Dishonesty runs through every aspect of the Brexit pitch, because the honest case for the ideological pet project of the Tory right is so unappealing that voters would never have endorsed it. If voters were told this during the 2019 election, I don't think they would have won. The Tories would have won. Now the Conservative Party is starting to pay attention to pay the political price. Getting Brexit done was the slogan that handed them a handsome parliamentary majority, but it no longer has the political salience it once did with voters. The local election results show they are more than willing to punish them for their consequences, and I think, in my opinion, I think The Guardian are reading way too much into local elections. Local elections are low turnout and are often used to kick the main elected party in Westminster. So I would not read into these recent elections too much. The opposition parties still have a lot of work to do. So for The Guardian to say, that Brexit has caused all of these problems and now the public are kicking the Tories about it, I wouldn't read into that. You never count the Tories out no matter what, and local elections are not the barometer of it. If they were, the Lib Dems would be doing very well in national elections and get large amounts of vote share. People are experiencing a toxic mix of high inflation, rising interest rates, and stagnating wages. Some of that is due to global factors, but the UK's new status as a growth laggard is the main outcome of Brexit. Meanwhile, NHS waiting lists are at record highs. Sunak missed his pledge on that recently, and patients are being treated in dilapidated buildings some of these are on the verge of collapse. Some of these flood. They have all sorts of issues. The populist pretense that leaving the EU was the magic fix for all of the country's woes has had terrible consequences. It has made us all poorer. You're talking about billions of pounds added to food bills every year. Absorbed huge amounts of diplomatic capital in attempts to resolve the issues it created in Northern Ireland, and cheapened our politics by normalising the spread of misinformation by those who should know better. I would argue that's been happening for a lot longer than Boris Johnson or the Tories, but sure. It has also exposed the Conservative Party is divided and lacking any coherent sense of mission. We knew the Tory party were incredibly divided, honestly. Little wonder that opinion polls show that most people think Brexit was a bad idea, but the clock cannot be turned back. This once-in-a-generation decision will haunt us for decades to come. And I don't think it's just that people are associating Brexit with the higher cost of living. I think the Tories' kind of mantra of COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has worked for the most part. But as other commentators have pointed out, that the promised boom from Brexit is not there, as Brexiteers and the right celebrate a potential German recession, say, look, things are not so bad here. They failed to see that economically Germany is doing better than us, with lower inflation, especially on key things like food and energy. Plus the fact that we know the ONS and the Bank of England are messing around with the basket of goods for inflation. Rent and mortgages are not included in the UK inflation metrics. Food, energy, and the cost of your mortgage or rent, these are the things that impact people the most, in my opinion anyways, and the more things start to bite regardless. If people connect it with Brexit, people I think are slowly realising that we have major problems. Also the fact that, Germany have reached their pre-pandemic levels for their GDP and we have not. So Germany kind of slowing down in growth and, having negative, sort of going into decline there, and having negative growth is a bad thing, no doubt. But given the fact that the UK are still not back to where we were, I still think Germany are in a better position than us. And the media can talk about, keep talking about the problems in Germany, but I don't think that will help the Tories enough. Whether people blame the Tories or Brexit for the problems the UK facing, there is one thing for certain. It's up to Labour and the media to help people connect the dots. And the Labour Party are not doing it. And I honestly wish the media were doing a better job here as well, because they have been woefully inept for a long, long time now. And it's about time they looked at themselves and realised they're enabling a bunch of lies. Honestly, there's so much for them to do, and so many problems they have caused us with their framing and their stupid questions. And all I want them to do, the main thing I want them to do is, when they talk to Tory politicians, ask them how they're going to pay for these funding promises when they ask Labour the same questions, or the Lib Dems the same questions, honestly. That's the main thing I want to see from them, at least some consistency in their questioning. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.